Okay, so we're looking here in our regular NASM textbooks. Like I said, we've moved out of Memler's, and this is going to be PFT 118, Physiology for Fitness, and we are looking at day 11 here. This is going to be chapter 4, exercise, metabolism, and bioenergetics. So this is your NASM materials here, which is cool because like it's kind of taken out any of the parts of like metabolism that we don't need and really just kind of boiling it down to like the essentials of like what's important to consider as it relates to a personal trainer, which really is just like how do your energy systems affect how you exercise, you know, like are you producing ATP rapidly? Are you producing ATP slowly? Do you have lots of ATP? Do you have very little? You know, what does that do? Do the byproducts burn your muscles and make them grow? Do the byproducts get synthesized really quickly to keep you having sustained energy? You know, what's going on? So we are going to be looking at basic information on energy metabolism and bioenergetics that are helpful for us to like create and implement effective exercise programs for our clients. So the goal here when we're talking about metabolism is really just to understand like which things enhance our ability to write an effective program. We want to target the right energy systems. So a lot of stuff we're going to be able to do. After this presentation, we want to understand like the primary methods for how we produce energy. So that's really what we started talking about last night, right? Glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. Differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. So whether that's taking place in the cytosol without any oxygen or whether it's taking place in the mitochondria with lots of oxygen. Our different energy pathways that predominate for our intensities and our durations. That one right there is probably probably the biggest one. Like, you know, which energy pathway is supplying you with ATP? Is it glycolysis when you're lifting at this many reps? Is it your aerobic metabolism when you're lifting at this many reps? We will also understand like how carbs, fats, and proteins fuel exercise. We know that protein does very little of it, but carbs and fats are really important. The different energy uses during steady state cardio, which is kind of cool. We'll look at like fat burning versus carb burning, the different requirements for intermittent exercise. So whether that is like high intensity and low intensity, and different adaptations that we get for that energy production. So like, you know, how's your body going to grow? So this is so funny. I had a video pop up on my feed. You know those ads that are like 20 minutes long? They just kind of like launch in and like you're supposed to skip them after like 15 seconds, but like they're like full on, like they're just somebody who put up a lecture and they like that is in their YouTube videos and they call it an ad. I got one of those last night, but it was about like it was from a trainer. Like I was like watching like I think I was watching like a cat TikTok compilation or some stupid thing. But something related to my job like snapped me out of it. Like and it was like I was just like listening to it while I was working on last night's stuff on Canvas. And it was this trainer who was like selling a program that was all about how to get your continuing education units to become better at teaching people how to condition. And he had this, and like, you know, conditioning is something that all trainers should be doing with their clients. But it was really cool because he had this moment where he's like, a lot of trainers don't really know what conditioning is or how to effectively implement it. And they don't even really know like the real definition. And I was like, that's so funny because I feel the same way. And I was like, this is pretty cool. It made me like listen to the ad a little bit longer. And then I was like, all right, I'm out of here. But it's like, I've already got my CEUs taken care of. I'm done. So conditioning, right, is all about like you could have somebody who's really, really, really strong, but like they might not have enough energy to get through like an entire athletic event, you know? This is what, I mean, we were just talking about like at the beginning, before we started this, before we launched into the lecture, we were just talking about like jujitsu and boxing, right? How many times have you like seen in like a fight where somebody just gets exhausted like before the fight is over? I mean, that's kind of what happened to like Conor McGregor. Right? He was at this weight class that he totally wasn't like used to fighting in. And his whole body was like, we don't have the energy stores to supply this size of a body with energy. Like, you have not trained for this. Like, and you know, you got wrecked. I mean, I don't know. Wrecked, whatever you want to say. I'm sure there's some Conor McGregor fan who's like ears pricked up just now. But like, you know, that's, you know, you have to condition for your specific sport, right? That's what conditioning is. It's actually very similar. We're about to transfer into our exercise psychology class, and we're going to be talking about the idea of what's called classical conditioning, which is the old school psychology that studies like how our brains create habits. All about how, like, you know, Pavlov's dog, you ring a bell and the dog, you know, thinks that it's getting a treat because you've done it over and over and over again. That is, you conditioned the brain. Well, conditioning is very much related to like how you've generated ATP. Your body is going to get used to like using specific energy systems. This is why, like, I always tell people, like, my body does not like glycolysis. My body likes to burn very intensely and then immediately like plateau and go straight into breathing really hard and get into aerobic metabolism like that. And so like I have to be like, when I'm lifting like at low repetitions, I usually actually will tack off, like, the normal hypertrophy range is like 6 to 12. My hypertrophy range is like 6 to 10. Like, I'll keep it much smaller, so that I can ensure that I'm staying in glycolysis and not kicking over into the wrong energy system. I'm like a little overly cautious about that. And I make sure that when I'm doing it, you know, and that's why I like stick to a very specific lifting tempo. If you ever watch me lift weights, you'll notice that I do like a lot of, you'll even see like sometimes like, it's not as intense as this, but I'll do like a little tiny head bounce. And that's me counting. My workout partner has like told me, he's like, yeah, your head bounces sometimes. And it's because I'm doing like 1, 2, 1, 2, do. I got like a rhythm in my head to make sure that I don't pop into that aerobic energy system. I'm trying to condition, you know, my cells specifically for a specific metabolism. And other times, you know, it's not like this month I've been doing a lot of aerobic training. And next month it'll go, you know, very much into very anaerobic training. So I loved that. I thought that was just such a cool thing, and I wanted to kind of share with you guys. Like, I saw it was just one line, and I was like, most people don't understand what conditioning is. And I was like, you're right, most people don't. And I just thought that was kind of cool. So we are talking about conditioning today, and one of those things, before we actually get into it, we need to understand another way of kind of describing this is understanding what is bioenergetics, right? Bioenergetics is a term that we use all the time, but it is the study of how energy is transformed through various biochemical reactions. So I always like to say it this way. It is how your body takes in something like a taco and turns it into 50 squats. Like, that's my favorite way to describe it, right? It is how your body takes in energy, breaks it into components, and then uses it to build up new pieces of you or to do like work, right? So if we're looking at what we're talking about, it is a big part of understanding metabolism, right? Metabolism, all chemical reactions that are taking place. But then we have exercise metabolism. So we have two separate little terms here. So we have and actually let's put a little sub-definition here. How the body takes in energy and transforms it into, just my R, work or new body tissue, etc. Right? This is how the body is going to take in food sources and do other stuff with it. So metabolism, right? We've been over this a bunch of times, but it is all chemical reactions in the body, right? And that is definitely metabolism, right? But we're also going to see the term exercise metabolism. And that is the specific metabolism that we usually deal with. Like, these are the parts of metabolism that we spend our time on. And it's the examination of bioenergetics as they relate to the unique physiologic changes that take place during exercise. So when we say exercise metabolism, we're describing like how metabolism interacts with the world of exercise. That's really like a much simpler definition, but that's what we mean, right? And so it's interesting because, like, you know, most of the time when we learned yesterday, even when we were just talking about glycolysis and the aerobic metabolism, there were definitely times where I mentioned like intensity and duration and things like that. But for the most part, like, you know, all of that was kind of under the understanding that like it's happening at the at like a basic level, you know. You walking around shopping for groceries or walking slightly uphill, you know. um, if you go like walking down the street and then all of a sudden that hill, you know, there's a slight hill, that's not really like intense exercise, but it does mean that you need to recruit more muscles. And so those muscle fibers have been sitting around doing basically nothing, and then all of a sudden they got recruited for a higher intensity. um, Even though that higher intensity is not actually like that high, you know, it's still a pretty darn low intensity. The fact that you started recruiting new muscle fibers means that they just started the process of like more energy production. So you may be in like the aerobic parts of your metabolism because you've been walking around for 20 minutes, but those new muscle fibers that are being recruited might be in glycolysis. And so you're still going to produce some lactic acid. You're not going to feel it because you're bringing in so much oxygen that that lactic acid is getting processed like instantly, until all of a sudden you go up a super steep hill and it starts, you know, burning enough to where maybe you even feel like you have to slow down. Well, now you've really recruited, you are officially recruiting all fibers, and all of those fibers are spitting out lactic acid. You're breathing to try to process all those byproducts, but those byproducts, you know, let's say you're producing at a gentle walk 100 units of lactic acid, but you're bringing in 200 units of oxygen. You know, this is just fake numbers that we just made up, but yeah, cool. Like that means that 100 units of oxygen is actually getting exhaled. Some of it's coming in and you're not even using some of it, and some of it's just getting exhaled. You actually, that's one thing that's sort of misleading about how we teach the respiratory system. We talk about how it's like oxygen in, CO2 out. That is still true, but there's actually a pretty good chunk of oxygen that also gets exhaled, because you don't end up using it. So some of that oxygen just works its way right out. It doesn't, because it doesn't diffuse into your blood, because your blood cell shows up to like drop off its CO2 and it's like, oh no, I'm good. Actually, I've already got some oxygen. So those two molecules have nowhere to bind. And then that red blood cell just keeps going on its merry little way. That's an actual like more shades of gray, accurate depiction of what's actually occurring during breathing. But when you are exercising and you're producing lactic acid, all that oxygen is getting sucked out of your red blood cells, which means they're very deoxygenated. And this is why you start to breathe harder and harder and harder and harder until eventually you're breathing as hard as you can, and you're still, you know, burning more and more and more and more. And it's like, I'm breathing so hard. Why are my muscles still burning? It's like, well, you've only got so much hemoglobin. You only got so many red blood cells, and you only got lungs that are large enough to bring in so much oxygen. You're still producing too much lactic acid. And so then there's lactic acid left over. So now, rather than producing 100 units of lactic acid and having 200 units of oxygen, maybe you increased your oxygen consumption, right? Your oxygen consumption's gone up because you've been breathing harder. So you're at 500 oxygen consumption, but you're no longer at producing 100 units of lactic acid. Now you're producing, let's say, 600. So every round of production, there's 100 left over, and just sits there and eats away at your muscles and burns, and that sucks. You know, that process right there is really what we're describing when we describe the difference between like metabolism in the traditional sense and exercise metabolism as it relates to like our industry. So our nutrient substrates we've got that are going to provide us with all this energy in order to do work are going to be proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, right? Your fats. These are the main substrates used to transfer energy into cellular energy, right? And so our nutrient substrates, right? Proteins, fats, and carbs that are used to be that are just transformed into metabolic energy, right? These things are we are able to break down the energy found in these nutrients in order to like provide us with the ability to do work. And we'll say that right here. So these nutrients have energy or calories in them that we are able to transform into chemical and mechanical work, right? So those nutrient substrates are how our enzymes are able to be produced and like do work. They're how our cells are able to like bring in glucose and stay alive. You know, like your nervous system, every time you create a little thought, you just burn some carbs. There's a fun little weird thing that we never think about, you know, like, you know, like next time you're like reading, you know, you're doing your homework and you're like, what did he say? I know there was some random stupid joke and it was related to like, oh God, just pull it somewhere. And then all of a sudden, like, you know, neuron Steve in the back who's been kind of like just hanging out is like, oh, I know, right? He brought in some glucose, produced some energy and brought the thought to the front of your head. And it's like, that's what it was, right? And so thinking actually burns a pretty substantial amount of energy, and your brain is on almost an exclusively glucose diet. So this definitely is the type of metabolism that prefers to use carbohydrates. This is actually why, by the way, I've brought this up before, but this is kind of just like a fun, weird fact. I don't know why I don't know how, I swear they must have done this for free, but I don't know how like they managed to get funding for something that really just does not have that big of an effect on the world. But these scientists decided to do a study on people's like logical reasoning, IQ, and things like that after they worked out. And they found that like after people exercised like crazy, they were dumber for a little while. Now that's not overall, like I'm not saying like in your overall life, but they just found that like for about an hour or two until you got a good meal and you got all that glucose going back to your nervous system rather than going to your muscle, your like ability to think and reason is ever so slightly diminished. And I always think that's like one of my favorite things I remember reading about. And I wish that I kept it because I thought it was so cool, but it was a fun little thing that one of my professors was like, here, everybody read this and tell me that how much you love working out. But it's true. It's like that's, you know, your nervous system is recruited like crazy to control your body during exercise. And so it gets into that mode rather than into, you know, deep philosophical thinking mode. Now, for the record, the reason we learned this when I was in school is because on the flip side, and we're going to talk about this when we get to youth training at the end of this mod, on the flip side, we know that like being physically active actually leads to greater like levels of like being able to recruit your brain. And they have found that like youths who engage in like physical activity, their brains actually grow in a really great way. And so actually in the end, it'll make you smarter, but in the short term, it kind of makes you dumber. That's kind of fun. I love that. So it's like a little brain investment. So your nutrient substrates, right? These are what have calories in them that allow us to do, you know, chemical work and mechanical work. It's either going to allow us to move around, think, or even just like produce metabolism. Carbohydrates are definitely the main one, right? So when we're looking at this, like carbohydrates are going to provide the body with a source of fuel and energy for all daily activities, including exercise. So it is the main substrate that we prefer to use for exercise metabolism. So this is, oh my God. So this is definitely like carbs are definitely our favorite. Your brain is almost on an exclusively glucose diet, like I said earlier, but your muscles also prefer to use carbohydrates, especially when you're exercising. And the reason for that is because like, if we know that exercise and duration are inversely related, right? Intensity and duration are inversely related. Like as intensity goes up, duration's got to go down. If duration goes up, it will naturally drive intensity down, right? I can't run at my 100-meter sprint pace for a marathon. It just doesn't work that way. But the fuel that you're using under those various circumstances is different. When you're at high intensity, so like in a situation where you're exercising, you're primarily burning carbohydrates for fuel, which when people hear that, they'll go, that's kind of a bummer because I'm here to burn fat, right? Like I'm here to burn off fat as a fuel source. Like I'm not worried about the very little amount of carbohydrates that I've got stored. Losing those glycogen stores does not make me look the way I want to look. I care about shedding off fat, right? And so like what we find is that like as your intensity climbs, you burn more and more carbs until eventually you get to maximal intensity and you're burning all carbs. This is what we're going to come back to in just a little bit, actually. Towards the end of this lecture, we'll be looking at this more in depth. But like when you are doing low intensity, your body actually does use fat pretty well for metabolism. Your body actually prefers to use kind of this high energy, you know, fat's got 9 calories in it. That's the most energy you're going to get out of any of the nutrients. And so like your body kind of prefers to just coast on burning fat for fuel when you're at a low intensity. So what's funny is you've got one time a day. If you, let's say you had, like if you tracked a 24-hour period, and during that 24-hour period, at one point this person went to the gym and they worked as absolutely hard as they can. They did as many burpees as fast as possible until they were about to throw up. So they worked as hard as possible, right? So, all right. And then afterwards, they recovered for the rest of their workout. They went about their day. They went grocery shopping. They did all their chores, picked the kids up from school. It's like that used to be like my go-to example when I would say stuff like this, and now I can't say stuff like this. You know, pick their kids up from the Zoom meeting. Did whatever, right? They lived a normal everyday life, but they had and that normal everyday life consisted of waking up, going to the gym, doing something else. So during that 24-hour period, there was one point of the day at which they were burning 100% fat for energy. Fat was supplying all of the energy that they needed to run their body. And at one time during that day, during that 24-hour period, they were strictly running on carbohydrates for energy production. So you might be wondering like what those are. I think Robert and Maggie, you guys know this because we've talked about this before. But Raul, if you had to guess, you just had to make an assumption, just because I'm picking on the new guy. What time of day would you assume you are burning 100% fat for fuel?
When you're asleep.
Look at that new guy coming in. Bam! That's pretty good. Yeah, absolutely. It's when you're asleep. It's when your energy processing is at its absolute lowest. And then on the flip side, when you were doing all those burpees, you're burning 100% carbs. You nailed it, right? So then we're always in a blend. We're always constantly in a blend of some type of that. So here's the thing. You burn the highest percentage of fat when you're in bed. So, I mean, if we were to say that, that would logically lead us to believe that the best way to burn fat off the body is to never leave our beds. But we know that that doesn't work very well, right? Like, in fact, that's probably how we got here in the first place. Was too much Netflix. So what the heck, right? Well, here's the thing. Like, again, we kind of got to look at it as a little bit of like an investment, right? Because you're always consuming some carbohydrates, you're always consuming some fats and things like that. And so if you burn off a lot of your carbs in the gym, you burn a bunch of calories. And that might not seem like they're the type of calories you want. Like, let's say in a weird, perfect scenario, and this is impossible to do, but let's just say we're going to break the laws of possibility, and you did a 60-minute workout that was 100% burning carbs for energy the whole time. So I don't know what happened. You like, it's some type of gym where all of a sudden you walked through the door and you were just like, ah, and just went nuts and then just got right into burning only carbs. And somehow didn't throw up. You somehow managed to keep it up for an hour, which we know would be impossible, because your body can only do this. And, you know, you're immune to lactic acid. This is, by the way, how you get something called rhabdomyolysis. If this were true, the scenario that I'm making, your kidneys would just shut down. Like, your body would start shedding protein, and then your kidneys would process it, and you just die. But like, for the sake of argument, let's say you somehow only burn carbs for fuel for that whole hour. Well, okay, let's say you burn 500 calories in that hour, right? Well, that means you burn 500 carb calories. So now you're back in your fat burning zone because you're walking around. It's like, all right, I need to go get my food on after my hard workout today. And what's going to happen is like all those carbs that could have possibly like that you're going to consume now, you burn through a glycogen providing you with that energy, right? That's where you got all those carbs from. I mean, some of it was in your blood, right? Some of it was like your regular blood sugar. But a good chunk of it was just like your body being like, man, we are in carb burning mode. So it started breaking off glycogen from all your liver and throughout all your muscles and stuff, and supplying you with energy that way. So now, like, if we know that carbohydrates are converted into fat whenever your glycogen stores are full, right? Like whenever you eat like a carb, your body goes, okay, well, I'm going to store that. But if it can't store it as glycogen, it's going to convert it to fat. So in the end, what ended up happening is you burned 500 calories worth of energy. And now when you bring in 500 calories worth of carbohydrates, all those carbohydrates are going to go straight into your glycogen stores because they're empty, which means they can't be converted to fat. And you are currently in the fat burning zone, which is great, right? Like you're in that low intensity. So you're utilizing fat for fuel now. And here's the other thing, when we exercise intensely, we create an energy deficit, we create an oxygen deficit. So now your body's gonna burn more calories over the next like 24 hours. Actually, sometimes up to 70, I think it's been observed up to 72 hours, although it is on like a sliding scale. So we can say 24 hours safely to, you know, a good 24 hours, weak for 48 hours, very weak after 72. You get an extra calorie burn. And again, that is during all this time that you are going to bed at some point, you know, sitting on the couch, doing your paperwork, whatever, all this stuff that's very low energy. So now you're burning more fat energy than you were before. And that's really great, right? So high intensity exercise, while it does rely on carbs, is definitely not something we want to avoid. And this is why HIIT training has been shown to be so effective. And we're going to look at this here in just a little bit. We'll come back to this concept towards the end here, but that's why we love carbohydrates so much. I know that I know that I harp on carbs a lot and talk about how great they are all the time, but this is definitely one of the biggest reasons, because carbs fuel you to work intensely, and working intensely is what gets results. I like fat too. I like protein too, but they're not your booster button. So another energy source is going to be our fats, right? Fats are going to provide the body with energy as well for low intensity, long duration activities. Right. Fat actually yields the highest amount of ATP per gram because it has the most calories per gram, right? When we look at, when we look at our substrates, you know, we've got proteins, fats, and carbs. Proteins and fats both have 4 calories in every gram, but fat has 9 calories per gram, right? So that's actually a really good source of energy. And this is why, you know, we do like fat. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely a fan of having plenty of fat in our diet, but it's used for different purposes, right? Like if I'm going to go for a long run, I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of fat in my diet and some carbohydrates to give me enough energy to kind of, you know, supply that long run doesn't become a long walk, you know? But at the same time, we definitely want to be aware that like we have a lot of stored fat that we can kind of tap into with our metabolism. And so like we can sort of tap into that if we make sure that like our diet consists of enough stuff to make us work hard and enough stuff to also like supply us with energy during exercise. And this is actually where you see some people like, I mean, this is where you'll see really rare circumstances of, we talk about like how it's very difficult to build muscle and burn fat simultaneously, right? Like we talk about how that's a very difficult thing to do, but the further you are away from your goal, like the more body fat that you have, the more that actually becomes a reality, because your body's like, yeah, I got plenty of energy stored here. I can burn some of that off and use all that energy to convert all that other stuff into new tissue, because we need all this new tissue we've never been active before, and now we are super active. I want to make sure that like we got some muscle to be able to do all this stuff. Now, protein, we do not really want to use as an energy source. This is another one that we've mentioned can be used. Like it does have calories in it, right? But protein can be used for energy production, but is typically used rarely. The body will try not to use protein for as long as it can. If it does, the body will prefer to not use protein as an energy source for as long as it can. But when it does, it's going to go through a process called gluconeogenesis, which I've already described a few times. Like I've described this process happening, but we haven't really gotten this definition down in a while. But gluconeogenesis, right, is going to be the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, such as amino acids, right? So gluconeogenesis, remember, like your three substrates, if you remember when we were like introducing these, right, they're all made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then protein's got this little troubling nitrogen over here, which is what's really cool and gives protein all of its unique shapes, but it does prevent your metabolism from being able to convert it into energy. Your body can't burn and go through glycolysis or the Krebs cycle with this troubling nitrogen in the way. So what your body does is it basically strips the nitrogen away. So actually, I wonder if I can find a good picture of this. Gluconeogenesis. I just want like a chart. Yeah, I don't really want like the whole process. That's not really what I'm looking for. Yeah. See, I would just draw this myself. I'm sure that somebody had, I'm sure there's a chart out here. I'm just looking for a basic version where basically if you took a molecule of nitrogen, I'm sorry, I took a molecule like an amino acid and you just ripped all the nitrogens out of there, you'd be left with all the normal ingredients for glucose. And so you would just rearrange them. Boom, suddenly you got a glucose molecule and it will go through gluconeogenesis. Now this can, it will go through your metabolism. Your body can do this from fats as well. This actually explains a lot of how, like I said, your body's on a glucose, your brain especially is on like a glucose diet. Well, what about people who are on keto? They're eating like 5 grams of carbs a day, right? That is a whole 20 calories worth of carbohydrates, right? Not very much. Actually, they can have like, I think up to 30 grams of carbs per day. So a whole 120. So if you're burning 1,200 calories in a day, that's fine because that's 10% of your energy. But like most of us aren't burning only 1,200 calories a day. So how the heck does your brain get all of its fuel? Where is it getting it from? It's going through that process of gluconeogenesis, converting it, doing a lot of extra work in order to make it happen, and now your brain's got fuel. But in the process of protein, because that nitrogen's extra, it has to be processed somewhere. Like it has to get out of your body. Your body's like, well, now I've got all this random nitrogen. So what's going to happen is your fluids throughout your body are basically going to carry it to your kidneys. Your kidneys are going to carry it to your bladder, and your bladder is going to get it out of your body. And so you're going to pee most of it out. This is actually one of the things that they look for when they try to figure out like if somebody is has like a metabolic disorder such as like diabetes. They're looking to see if their body is basically converting things in really weird ways. And so they'll look for how much protein is coming out in your urine. And this is also why like sometimes like I'm sure we all know somebody who's on that like super high protein diet. And it's like, man, like your BO smells worse than like the average person. Some of that's hormones as well. But like a lot of times like that can be a thing on a super, super high protein diet because there's extra urea coming out in your sweat. There's a fun little weird fact for you, by the way. Urea is the main compound that makes up urine. You add water to urea, you get urine. But there's a lot of urea in your sweat. like a ton. Not something we want to think too much about, considering that we're in an industry where we sweat a lot. Walking around with urine all over you. Did I ruin it? Yeah. So that's gluconeogenesis. Your body really doesn't want to do this, but it will, right? So, all right, let's go ahead. So now we've got, we've talked a little bit about like metabolism and our nutrient substrates and things like that. Let's go ahead and look one more time and review what we talked about yesterday. Talk about energy and work, right? Right. If we're talking about adenosine triphosphate, oh my God, right, or ATP. It is a primary source of immediate energy for cellular, I'm going to say work instead of cellular metabolism, because I think that's a much better descriptor. It describes how your cells do the things, right? You need to make ATP in order for your cells to be able to break that ATP and release that energy and then use that energy to do stuff. Basically, it is a molecule of adenosine with 3 phosphates attached. There is a lot of energy trapped between the bonds of those phosphates, particularly the second and third. And when the bonds that hold that ATP together are broken, energy is released for cellular work, right? And that will, after that bond is broken, we are left with adenosine diphosphates, or ADP, right? 2 phosphates. You basically kick the third one off, and then we're left with it. And so ATP is required in order to do, like I said, mechanical and cellular work. See, NASM got with the program towards the end. They used the word work instead of metabolism. So that's really what we're seeing there in an ATP molecule, right? So here we go. We got a couple different ways. We have another energy system that we're going to introduce that we did not talk about yesterday. So yesterday we talked about glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And those are sort of like the smaller bits of our metabolism, but we actually have to kind of zoom out a little bit in order to see like a few other systems here. So there's a system that takes place pre-glycolysis, and it's known as your phosphagen system. Or sometimes it's called your phosphocreatine system. Sometimes it's called your creatine phosphate system. NASM is going to call it the adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system. The ATP-PC system, which is a much easier way to say that. When we look at like energy production, right? We got all these different systems for producing ATP, right? So the first one is going to be your ATP. We're going to go in terms of duration here. You're going to have your anaerobic, right? And again, these are the energy production systems that take place in a non-oxygen environment, right? So they do not require oxygen, right? Sorry, dogs are barking. So that is our anaerobic energies, right? And yesterday we started with the glycolysis, but today we're going to start with this ATP-PC system. And this is the ATP-PC system, right? Which is going to be provide energy for short duration, high intensity work by replenishing ATP very rapidly, right? This energy system lasts about 6 to 10 seconds. So here's the thing. This is a super, super, super fast working system that produces lots of ATP very, very rapidly, but you can only do it for about 10 seconds. Unless you're incredible at it, maybe you can last a little longer. But here's the thing, this is not even necessarily a true energy production system. This is actually why we didn't mention it yesterday, because Memlers is taking a look at things very much from like the medical side of things and the biological side of things. They aren't really looking at exercise, which is a very special circumstance, right? They were looking at metabolism. We are looking at exercise metabolism. So what happens in the ATP-PC system is basically you have a molecule of ATP that has been broken down at some point. And so you were left with ADP, right? You were left with adenosine diphosphate. But your body also produces this other really, really cool material that you're probably familiar with called creatine. And so that's what this PC stands for. This is the phosphocreatine side of things, right? The adenosine triphosphate phosphocreatine system. And so because creatine has like a little phosphate attached to it, what it'll use is it'll use this little enzyme that it has there called creatine kinase, and that will break the phosphate off of that creatine and reattach it back and use it to reattach the phosphate back onto your ATP molecule. So PC creatine kinase. So if we look at this, getting the picture that I want, hopefully. Yeah, kind of. I just want to look at it reattaching.
I think you pulled up a GIF last time, Brad, and it was there.
Oh, you're right. I forgot. I got obsessed with GIFs for a little while. Oh, it's not moving. Well, you know what? Honestly, this picture works just fine. You're right, though. I did totally get obsessed with GIFs for a little bit. But here's what we're seeing, right? So you got an ATP molecule, right? Or you're left with an ADP molecule, right? A phosphate has been kicked away, right? And so a whole bunch of energy has been released, and now you're left with A2-phosphate, ADP, diphosphate. And creatine's sitting over here with its little extra phosphate, and so it uses an enzyme to just kick that right off and attach it over there. So you basically you're not necessarily making new ATP, you're just reattaching phosphates to a broken ATP. This is why it's able to do it so fast. This is why it's able to happen at like a super rapid speed, because you're not actually really making anything. You're just sort of resynthesizing it and recycling it, right? But you're left with that. You have to be able to do this with creatine, right? Creatine has these extra phosphates in it, and you only have so much creatine inside of your body. But this is actually why power lifters and weightlifters and people in our industry, this is why we take creatine as a supplement, is to boost our own natural creatine levels. So by having like higher levels of creatine in your body, you're going to be more likely to be able to reattach those phosphates. But here's the thing. Creatine works really well. And then, to be fair, the one other thing that creatine does is it also is very good at driving water into your cells. This process is very much a hydrolysis thing. So it requires like lots of water in order to happen. And that's why if you've ever taken creatine, a lot of times you'll gain weight pretty rapidly early on because your body will start holding on to water. And then when you go off that creatine, a lot of times you'll shed all that water right back off. And sometimes that'll mean that you lose some of the size that came along with it. But hopefully what happened is like you built enough muscle during that time that even when you do lose a little bit of that water weight, you know, you're still left with larger muscles in the end. So when we look at like how to take creatine, is it effective if you're taking creatine when you're doing a program where you're lifting 15 to 20 repetitions? Not really, and not if those repetitions are at a medium tempo, because what's going to happen is you're targeting your aerobic metabolism, not your anaerobic metabolism. Creatine is much more effective, especially in this first 6 to 10 seconds. Then there's a little bit of like puffiness that happens during glycolysis, but that's really not, you know, creatine's necessarily a thing. That's just the sort of water weight part of it. So that's one of the things that we want to kind of be aware of. Like my clients will ask me all the time, they're like, should I take creatine? Is it helpful? And I'll be like, well, we can. We can go, you know, we can look at using creatine as like a supplement. However, we just got done doing like a heavy weightlifting routine, and you would have been better off taking it over the last 4 weeks. We're about to go through like a cutting cycle where we do, you know, much more highly intense, long duration, you know, not highly intense, but like long duration, like big calorie burns. Um, let's hold off for 30 days while we sort of, you know, work on this conditioning aspect, and then we'll come back to it and we can do some of that heavy lifting, and then we'll look at creatine. And that's great because your clients will really appreciate that. You know, like that's a great way to like save your clients money so that they don't take it at the wrong time. Although creatine is like super cheap. As far as supplements go, creatine is real cheap. Just buy straight up pure creatine monohydrate. That's, you know, you can get a giant tub of that stuff for a couple bucks. So that's the first part of our anaerobic metabolism. That's the new one. Then we've got glycolysis, right? And glycolysis is going to provide energy through the breakdown of glucose to create ATP for moderate intensity, moderate duration work. So this is what's so funny, right? Like this is where like I wish I gotta remember to like not do this the next time I get to like the yesterday's lecture, because we do always say, like, we talk about glycolysis, a lot of times the slides will say used for high intensity work, and that's relatively true to like a normal person, but not to us, right? Like we're trainers. When we say high intensity, we mean like high intensity. Glycolysis is a moderate intensity energy system in the world of like personal training. This is like, again, the difference between metabolism and exercise metabolism. The true high intensity stuff is this stuff right here, right? Glycolysis is now in the middle. And so this is going to last about 30 to 50 seconds. And you'll notice there's a little gap here, right? What's happening? Well, what about 10 to 20 seconds, right? Well, that's where you're kind of switching, you know, in between these two, right? If you've got plenty of creatine, maybe you've gotten it to last a little bit longer, and glycolysis is going to kick in a little bit later. If not, glycolysis is going to have to kick in beforehand. So there's definitely like none of this is perfect. But that's why we see glycolysis. It's going to last about 30 to 50 seconds. So this is the system that produces all that lovely lactic acid that makes us so sore. And we know that like when lactic acid happens, it is so acidic that it damages our muscle cells, right? Remember how when we were talking about the digestive system, I mentioned that if you were to take your stomach acid out of your stomach and pour it onto your arm, it would literally start, you know, digesting your arm. Well, luckily, lactic acid is not quite as acidic as your stomach acid, thank goodness. But it is a little acidic, and it is enough to create some cellular damage. So when you create enough of that cellular damage and it sits there and destroys your muscle cells, your body goes, well, heck, like I gotta fix all that crap. You broke all the walls, you know? So what it's gonna do is it's gonna come along and create like an immune reaction, which will usually consist of a little bit of inflammation. And that inflammation will get to work repairing all that damage that you created. And this is that sort of muscle soreness that we get after we leave the gym, where you're just like, oh God, you know, like you're sort of peeling all those fibers apart because your body's like, oh, you know, you produced a whole bunch of lactic acid and you didn't burn that lactic acid off. Here's what's kind of funny. The best way to keep from being sore is actually to do more work during your sessions. You want to make sure that you don't get super sore from exercise. Do some jumping jacks, do some jumping rope, even just go for like a light, intense walk in between all your sets, and you'll burn that lactic acid off for fuel during, you know, slightly higher or during slightly longer duration. Raul, I'm seeing a thumbs up. Was that supposed to be a hands up, or is that?
It was a thumbs up to the jump rope.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to burn off any of your lactic acid to ensure that, like, you know, you end up using it as a fuel source. And that's what's so funny, right? Like when people, it's like, you ask like somebody on the street, you're like, hey, how do you keep from being sore after your workout? And they'll go, I don't know, stretch. And it's funny because, I mean, that helps. Stretching will help for about 2, 3, 4 minutes after you're done stretching, but inevitably you're going to tighten up afterwards, right? When you draw in a bunch of blood to the area, it reduces your soreness temporarily because a whole bunch of oxygen gets delivered. But then as soon as that's like processed, it's over and you go back to being sore. You want to keep from being sore, do some cardio at the end of your workout. It'll burn that lactic acid off and keep it from sitting there and causing any more damage. But if you're a bodybuilder, I don't know, maybe you don't want to do that. Maggie, you have a question?
Yeah. So should you be targeting those body parts that your weight training, you know, so if you're, you know, doing a bunch of arms that day, should you do a cardio, you know, in between? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love this question.
Like you're targeting your legs that day and you're going to be extra sore tomorrow, so should you do an extra little walk, or like, you know, are you targeting those parts of the body while you're, you know, doing the extra cardio?
Yeah. So luckily, your body is just going to run that stuff through your blood. And for the most part, like as long as you do cardio really anywhere, it's going to eventually get that oxygen to where it needs to go. And it's going to process it. So that's what's kind of lucky. But I will say this. Let's say let's say you're doing like heavy barbell squats and you decide to like burn some of that lactic acid off and you go hit some battle ropes that are nearby, right? Which is a very upper body based cardio. Well, now you are going into, you got to spend the first part of your metabolism, you know, you're just now recruiting the arms for the first time. They haven't been doing any work. So they got to go through the ATP-PC system. Then they got to go through glycolysis.
Right.
And then they eventually got to get to their oxidative metabolism. So that's definitely something to consider. You might not have, like, if you're not doing a long enough duration, it might not have a very big effect. And you might end up creating some soreness elsewhere because you got to get back to your next set. So then, like, you end up producing lactic acid, and then you stop doing that activity, and you leave it sitting there while you go back to squats. This is a somewhat good thing, by the way, if you're trying to create, like, you know, if you're trying to strengthen your blood vessels and you're going upper body, lower body like that, this is actually great for other reasons. But in terms of like your soreness, it can be a little shaky sometimes. But on the other side of things, there is some really new research. This is sort of not direct. That's kind of the answer to your question. But one other thing that's just kind of fun to talk about, they've done some really interesting research to look at, you know, spot fat losing. You know what I mean by that? Like people always want to lose belly fat, right? Like that's the thing that they're trying to like target. But we know that like we have a really hard time like targeting specific areas. Like it's just not something that works very well. You can't target body fat. You're going to lose body fat where you lose body fat. And the reason for that is because your body, yeah, those tissues like that are using all that energy need those calories. And so maybe it comes from your body fat. It just gets into your blood and transported to where it needs to go. So I'm taking belly fat when I'm doing my sprints, you know, for the most part. But theoretically, you would think that like your body would want to burn fat from the areas that it is providing with energy, right? And so like we've always had this kind of big theory that like that is how it should be happening, but we just haven't ever really been able to find very good evidence. So they took a pretty intense approach to see if this is true, and they biopsied some people's muscle, which literally means like cutting a chunk out of them. And they did find that like your body does prefer to metabolize things somewhat near where you're using that energy. And it does kind of explain why your legs tend to be a little bit leaner, especially like if you're a consistent runner, your arms, like whatever, depending on what type of like athlete you are. So how do you spot lose? Again, I think the right answer to tell the common folk is you can't. I think that's definitely like the right answer still, because that's going to have like, that's going to create the type of work ethic that we really do kind of want to focus on. But theoretically, they found that like if you do cardio, which is a fat burning type of metabolism because it's long duration, right? that is based around where you're burning most of your energy from, you might be able to spot lose a little bit from that site. This is all very new, by the way, and we haven't really even found that great of a way to like apply it, because it's like, you know, what are you gonna do? You want to lose belly fat and then just do a bunch of crunches for cardio? That means that you got to do tens of hundreds of crunches at a super rapid speed in order to get your heart rate up. What makes you burn the most calories is working large muscle groups. This is why running, cycling, and things like that are so popular. They recruit lots of muscle. Your abs are bacon strips. Like, they're just not very large. So in order for you to elevate your heart rate by working your ab muscles, good luck. I haven't figured it out yet. You know, so that's what's kind of funny. I actually did love, I used to look this up and show people how many crunches would it take to burn 3,500 calories. If we know there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat, it would take you 17,500. Now here's the thing. I also don't burn 3,500 calories in a workout. So that number is slightly inflated, you know, because it's like, well, I wouldn't burn 3,500 calories. Let's say I did, you know, 500 a day. So that would mean that you need to burn 17,500 in a week divided by 7 days. That's still 2,500 calories a day. I'm sorry, 2,500 sit-ups a day just to burn 500 calories a day. Again, good luck. You know, you'd maybe get through one day of that, and then like you'd wake up and be like, I can't get out of bed. All right, I guess I'm calling in sick to work. So, bacon strips. All right, this is also like that adductor abductor machine. I want to lose it from my thighs. Tiny strips, tiny muscles. All right, and lastly, we have got our oxidative metabolism, right? So this is going to be our aerobic or oxidative metabolism, right? Which is going to be the most complex of the energy systems. It is a process that takes place, that uses the aid of oxygen to generate ATP. It says it's a process. It's kind of like, honestly, it's more like the process is. So there's 3 sections to this. And here's the one that's very confusing to people who have only studied regular old biology version. Glycolysis is back. But earlier I said glycolysis is anaerobic. But this is aerobic glycolysis. So there is one that we also didn't mention yesterday. Aerobic glycolysis is basically acting as the stopgap between switching from anaerobic to aerobic. So when we look at aerobic glycolysis, there we go. I think this is what I want. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So here's where we're seeing like a slight difference between anaerobic glycolysis, which is the glycolysis we've been talking about, and aerobic glycolysis here. So you got glycogen, which breaks down into glucose. In anaerobic glycolysis, ATP instantly, done and done, right? And then you're left, because there's insufficient oxygen, you're left with some pyruvic acid, which will ferment into lactic acid. In aerobic glycolysis, glycogen gets broken down, you're left with glucose, that gives you some ATP, it becomes, and you're left with pyruvates. But because there is sufficient oxygen, what will happen is your body will combine it with a little bit of water and spit out some ATP, and now that's gonna go into the rest of the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. It'll go through like the other processes afterwards. So this is basically acting, like I said, as like a stopgap when you are transferring from one type of metabolic reaction to another. It's there to kind of pass off the load, right? It's not like it just instantly switches from one energy system to the other. You've got a little bit of aerobic glycolysis, which is taking place where you're having glycolysis, but there is sufficient oxygen in the area. This is also kind of the difference between how we generate our type 2A muscle fibers and our type 2X muscle fibers. Remember when I mentioned muscle fiber types, you get two of the fast twitch types, right? And like one of them is your true fast twitch. That's very much anaerobic, right? That's like fast twitch that's relying on ATP-PC, and that's fast twitch that's relying on anaerobic glycolysis. But when you have like those type 2A fibers, which are called your fast twitch oxidative fibers, these are fibers that get a little bit more myoglobin. They get a little bit more oxygen delivery. So they're better at sort of transferring things off, or maybe they're good at producing, before the transfer is over, they're good enough at just staying active enough and just intense enough that you get to a point where you can recover. And so like, football is a very, very, very good example of that. What's funny about like football training is that football actually looks, I mean American football, right? Football actually looks very much like bodybuilding training sometimes. Like you would think that being athletes, they would spend a lot of their time, and you look at these giant dudes, you would think that they spend a lot of their time doing maximal lifts, and certain positions do, don't get me wrong. But like a lot of times they end up training like bodybuilders. You think about bodybuilding, you're like, well, bodybuilding's not like great at anything. And that's true, but it's a little good at everything, which is kind of what you want in a sport like football. You want to be able to lift heavy, but you're not going to be breaking any powerlifting records. You want to be able to run for relatively good durations, and but you're not going to be breaking any like marathon records. And you want to be able to like run pretty fast, but you're not going to break any sprinting records. Definitely faster than some, but not like perfect. And that's really what we're seeing here. This is a moderate, like in the middle. And we see that with glycolysis here too, right? So we're seeing like two versions of moderate intensity, the aerobic version and the anaerobic version. Athletes, for most sporting events, you are primarily going to rely on aerobic glycolysis. And this is why it's so important if you do want to be a well-rounded athlete. Yeah, you need to work at super high intensities sometimes, but you also need to make sure that you do we're bringing it back, conditioning. You got to have a little bit of cardio. If you're a power lifter, lift heavy. But if you want to be like a rounded athlete, lift heavy, do a little bit of cardio, and you got to go through these like different cycles of training. This is why undulating training is so popular in athletics. That and also like some recovery benefits. But when I say undulating training, rather than going through just like linear cycles of like I'm doing a linear cycle right now, right? I've been doing high rep. Next month I'm going to do medium rep. Next month I'm going to do low rep, right? Linear. But non-linear training is what we call undulating. And that's where, if we think of like high rep, medium rep, low rep, right? Instead of doing that for a month at a time with these big long lines, I would go from here, down to here, down to here, back to here. And this would be every week, right? I'd have these little waves. I'd undulate like a waterbed. And so that's what we see a lot of times in like football training. They'll have a day where they like do super explosive and they target the ATP-PC system. Later on that week, they'll train glycolysis in both like, aerobic and maybe anaerobic glycolysis. And then at the end of the week, they'll probably do some low intensity stuff as they're getting closer to the game because like they don't want to be exhausted for the game. So they're going to do some low intensity, long duration stuff. And that's sort of that's what we found to be very effective in a lot of athletics. Let's go ahead and look at this process here. So aerobic glycolysis is going to be glycolysis that occurs in the presence of sufficient oxygen, right? Oh my God. Fingers are so dumb. That's aerobic glycolysis. It acts as the stopgap. Actually, we'll go like this. Stopgap between anaerobic and aerobic parts of metabolism. There we go. Then we've got the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, sometimes, or sometimes referred to as the lactic acid cycle. It's got a million different names. And so the citric acid cycle is going to use is the process that uses the byproducts of glycolysis to produce ATP, right? And it creates NAD and FAD as byproducts to be used later on in aerobic metabolism. I almost wrote metabolism. Then you have got the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain, the final part of aerobic metabolism that uses the byproducts of the Krebs cycle to produce massive amounts of ATP. But here's the thing, it does it pretty slowly. I mean, you know, your Krebs cycle's got to get all this, like your Krebs cycle's waiting for all this other stuff to get created. So it's just like sitting around like, okay, great, here's a ton. And it makes 34 ATP and then it waits again. It's like, all right, I need some more byproducts. 34, you know, like it makes a ton of ATP, but it does it very, very, very slowly. It has to rely on these other parts of our metabolism to kind of get done first. And so that's definitely a difference that we're seeing there. This is why it's so good at giving us energy for like long duration, right? Versus like short duration. And the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle both often rely on fat to be metabolized here. And that's what we're going to see one little kind of sub-special note here. So I'm going to put this sort of on this line. And I'm going to put little, so fat can be metabolized aerobically thanks to a process called, and this is always weird because I got to draw a beta symbol and I can't remember. Hold on a second. Alt symbol beta. How did I get the beta symbol? Alt 225. Beta oxidation. Okay. So beta oxidation is a process where basically you lift the parts of a fat molecule away that are preventing it from being converted into acetyl-CoA. And so now you're left with acetyl-CoA, and it goes through the Krebs cycle. Then it works its way through the electron transport chain, just like you normally see. This is what we're seeing a lot of times in people who are on keto diets, right? They're relying a lot on this beta oxidation process. But beta oxidation is much more effective when you have carbohydrates supplying the energy burn beneath it. And this is why you'll see this term a lot that says like fat burns in a flame of carbohydrates. And so the more carbohydrates you have in your diet, the easier it is to release that energy from fat through beta oxidation. And that's why we like having carbohydrates in our diet. So produces lots of ATP, but it produces it relatively slowly, which is fine considering that, you know, a marathon is a couple hours long. So slow away. All right. Raul, how you feeling about our energy systems? Oh, did we lose him for a second? All right, I'm gonna assume good. We're moving on. So let's take a look at duration, right? Let's take a look at duration and energy systems. Actually, you know what? We'll label this work versus duration, right? So intensity and duration are inversely related. So intensity and duration have an inverse relationship, right? And what we mean by that is that as intensity goes up, duration must come down. As intensity goes down, duration can go up. So that is definitely something we see. If you try to do your 1 rep max, you're only going to be able to do 1 rep. That is a very short period of time. But if you lift at a lower percentage of your 1 rep max, you'll be able to keep going. And so the reason for this is the amount of energy available from stored ATP from your phosphocreatine, like that, the amount of energy from ATP-PC is really small. That's why it only lasts 6 to 10 seconds. Whereas the amount of energy from carbohydrates that have been stored is way greater. You've got way more carbs stored in your body, and your body can go through the process of glycolysis for a relatively long time compared to the ATP-PC system. But it's still limited, right? It can only last maybe 30 to 50 seconds. Now, here, and by the way, really quickly, talking about like staying in glycolysis for slightly longer durations. Let's say you try to like lift in glycolysis for maybe about 2 minutes. That's where you're transferring to that aerobic glycolysis. This is why like you can still train glycolysis when you're doing like cardio workouts. In fact, that's actually what I've been doing for this month, right? Is I've been training aerobic glycolysis. I'm trying to like run relatively intensely, but not intensely enough that it's full on sprints. So I've been doing a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. Yesterday, I was sprinting up Fryman Canyon for 1 minute, not when I say sprint, I mean like sprinting relative to the fact that I'm only taking 1 minute of rest, which is not very long. And so like what I did was sprint up Runyon for 1 minute, and then the next minute I continue walking up Runyon like nonstop, and then sprint again, and then walk again, do 5 rounds, turnarounds, jog down the hill, which really doesn't burn that much energy, and repeat for a total of, I wanted to do 24 minutes yesterday, so to repeat for a total of 12 rounds. I wish the Fryman was longer, and then I would just be able to keep going. But unfortunately, it's only got so much uphill aspect. Now, let's say I change that to a 1-to-2 ratio instead of a 1-to-1 ratio. I'd probably want to drop my time down. So rather than focusing on like a full minute, which is very much that aerobic glycolysis, right? I'd drop it down to, let's say, 30 seconds. Now I'm falling between that 30 to 50 second mark. That's my anaerobic glycolysis. I'll be able to sprint much, much, much harder, but it's also going to take me longer to recover. So I'll do, instead of a 1-to-1 ratio, I'll do a 1-to-2 or maybe a 1-to-3 ratio. Sprint for 30 seconds, recover for 60 seconds or 90 seconds, and repeat for a bunch of rounds. Does that make sense, guys? Cool, cool. All right, so the amount of energy, and then, so the amount of energy from ATP-PC, really short, right? 6 to 10 seconds. The amount of energy from carbs, somewhat short, moderately short, right? The amount of energy from fat, essentially unlimited, right? Let's just think about, like, you got 3,500 calories in 1 pound of fat, right? And that's really kind of how that works. If you look at like, somebody who has 10, let's say they weigh, 180, we'll go 180 pounds, and you've got 10% body. Let's say you have 5% body fat, right? Like, this is somebody who is practically no fat, right? Times 0.95, no, 0.05. That means they have 9 pounds of fat. That's 31,500 calories worth of energy once you get to your aerobic metabolism. And that's only if you are using all of your fat. So actually, you've got 31,500 calories of if you were asleep. And so you would have to burn a whole bunch of calories to get there. The amount of fat that you have is essentially unlimited because carbs are there to play like an underlying support role. And even if you run out of all your carbs, like say you burn all your glycogen off and you've got no more, you got no sugar in your blood or anything, and you switch strictly to fat burning, 31,000. Let's see here. I'd be curious. How many calories do you burn during sex, of course, marathon? Of course, Google. Yeah, maybe a whopping 2,600. You know, if you burn about 100 calories a mile, that could be up to 2,600. It's close, right? But still, you'll probably have passed out before then. If you really only have like 10% body fat and you really did burn through your glycogen, you really are trying to do something like that, chances are your body's just going to go, all right, well, we're done. It's just going to make you lay down. This is why we need these are the things that we're looking at when we look at work versus duration. So the bioenergetics of exercise are usually measured based on intensity, right? Intensity and duration. We're constantly like looking at that. But if we're looking at it right, the ATP-PC system, right, provides energy very rapidly, but can only do it for a limited time. Right? Intensity and duration being backwards of each other, right? Glycolysis provides energy fairly moderately rapidly, but can only do it for a moderate duration time. And then we have aerobic or oxidative metabolism. Provides energy relatively slowly, but can do it for an essentially, we'll put it in parentheses, unlimited amount of time, right? And this, we'll fill this in a little bit, relies on creatine or phosphocreatines for energy, for ATP production. Really, actually, it doesn't have that word. Huh. Glycolysis is going to rely on glucose for ATP production. And your oxidative metabolism is going to rely on fat for ATP production. Okay. Fat and the byproducts of the other parts of your metabolism. Okay, so things that we can do to increase our calorie burn. We got some non-note stuff here. So the cost of exercise is going to depend on like how you're lifting, right? Laying supine will burn fewer calories than standing. Lay on your back doesn't burn as many calories as standing up, right? Sitting doesn't burn as many calories as standing. Sitting burns more calories than laying down though. So if we're just trying to create like you know, we spent a whole mod talking about like how to basically boost energy expenditure throughout the day. If that involves like, you know, our clients as well, we want to make sure that we are trying to keep our clients on their feet as often as possible, because that's just going to burn a few more calories. We're going to focus on compound lifts because those are going to burn a few more calories, right? But we're also going to see some really fun things here, especially this one right here, which is excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. This is where we get to my favorite topic, which is EPOC, right? So excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, right, is going to be an elevated calorie burn that, I'm sorry, we'll say it, elevated oxygen consumption that occurs after strenuous exercise, right? So the body will burn more calories in response to intense exercise after the workout is over, sometimes lasts up to 72 hours. So this is really what we're trying to do. The harder that we work, the more your body is to consume oxygen afterwards. Because none of us do like an intense sprint where we're like, and then like stop sprinting, and then we're like, done. Awesome. That went well. You know, like that's not how that works, right? Like you continue breathing to process all that crap that you just created. And there's all sorts of little bit of extra stuff left over afterwards running around your body that your body's like trying to get to and destroy. So it's always consuming a little bit of extra oxygen after your workout, and that's awesome. Here's the other thing. You are going to be in the fat burning zone while you're burning all those extra calories. You're going to be sitting on the couch burning primarily fat. So like we were worried, we were like, oh no, I want to be in the fat burning zone. I want to primarily burn fat, but that means that you're going to be at a low intensity. You're burning a higher percentage of fat, but you're burning less fat calories, and you're not developing as much EPOC because you aren't working very hard. You're not consuming very much oxygen. So what ends up happening is you actually burn less calories overall. One of my favorite freaking studies I've ever read is about how they put two groups of people and they had both of them burn the same number of calories, right? We know that there's 3,500 calories in a fat. That means that everybody should have had similar results, right? But they had one group do it by doing interval training, which by the way, burned less energy in the gym. They ended up like, because like steady state, they were able to kind of monitor their intensity and go at a steady enough state to burn like a higher number of calories overall in the gym. But then the other group burned less calories in the gym initially. I'm describing this slightly wrong. They burned the same number of calories overall. The group that did interval training had to do it over a longer duration because the other group was able to get it done faster. They were able to get to, let's say, 500, right? Whereas the other group, because they had to like recover, and that's such a low calorie burn, it took them a little longer to get there. One group, you know, they both burned at like different rates, but they ended up burning like the same calorie. They should have lost the exact same number of weight, but the group that did interval training lost nearly twice as much. Not quite twice as much, but like a lot more, right? That's a huge difference. And it's because their body burned extra energy once they left the gym. They kept burning energy. And the other group, their energy burn was, I mean, they kept burning energy too. EPOC happens whenever you exercise, but way less, significantly less. So it results in less, less burn. Also, you get all these elevations in your hormones, which continues to burn energy. You get elevated like stress hormones, and then like you get elevated sex hormones, which result in like muscle building, which the more muscle you have, the more calories you're also going to passively burn. So we love high intensity work. We love it. And you don't have to worry about bulking up. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. We just know that we like high intensity work. It's a great way to create these deficits the way we want to. So during intermittent work, right? Glycolysis will provide the energy for work, and your oxidative system will provide the recovery. So, so during intermittent work, which is a very fancy way of saying interval training, glycolysis will provide energy for work, and the oxidative metabolism will provide energy during recovery, right? So you'll work really hard, build a bunch of lactic acid, and then your body will recover that with your oxidative metabolism, which is primarily burning fat. How in the heck do we measure all this stuff? This will be our last thing we talk about today. How do I actually measure this? Well, it's not very easy. You need a lab. Or you need a machine. I mean, nowadays they got those freaking Bluetooth VO2 machines. I guess technically you could buy one of those and put it in your mouth. Those are pretty freaking cool, by the way. Look at this. Bluetooth VO2 max tester. This is amazing, because until like these things, freaking the VO2 master, that's right. This freaking thing, you just strap it on your head and it just sits there. I mean, it's still big and a thing that you got to strap on your face and stuff, but like that's so freaking cool. I normally normally the way we'd measure oxygen consumption is this freaking beastly machine here. This goes to your phone. For me right now, I'm living in the future. like I would have never thought that like they'd do this. And then it's like, well, I want one of those. Well, okay, here we go. Boop. They know it, man. It's the friggin', they know what it's worth. Someday though. I mean, you could, for the record though, guys, I mean, that is super expensive. Don't get me wrong. But you could run a business off of VO2 testing. Like VO2 max test near me. Normally you go to like these facilities. I don't know what body spec is, but like say you go to this company here, they're gonna put you through, they get that machine because they got like a little treadmill there. If you have one of those Bluetooth ones, you could go to people's houses and do it. And how much does this cost? I don't want the DEXA scan, I want the VO2 test. Oh, you freaking jerks. Oh, I hate it when people don't put, there we go, $100 each. I get so mad when they don't put prices on websites. How much does it cost? I don't know. Give us your email. I will not. I will hunt you down instead. So $100. So 50 people, you paid for the freaking thing. And it's awesome because now you take the guesswork out. You make somebody wear a heart rate monitor while they're doing their VO2 test, and it's like, hey, Maggie, did you want to know how much oxygen you consume when your heart rate's 140? This much. That means that you burn this many calories per hour. That means if you eat a 300 cupcake, the 300 calorie cupcake, and you're like, oh, I got to burn an extra 300 calories today. You can look at your chart and be like, that means I need to do 20 minutes at 120, or I could do 10 minutes at 170. Kind of cool. It's math, which sucks, but that's cool. So I love VO2 tests. I'm a big fan. They're a great way for trainers to actually make a living. I have like, if you guys want to steal this business plan, I'm telling you, I think it'd be successful. You open a whole company that is based all around fitness assessments, postural analysis, body fat testing, and VO2 tests, and then you just write somebody a workout, and then you check in with them once a month. Pretty hands-off stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what I mean when I'm saying all this. So what about like how much oxygen is going in versus how much is being used by your cells? That is referred to as your respiratory quotient, or RQ, right? It is the amount of CO2 exhaled divided by the amount of O2 consumed, right? So it is measured using a metabolic analyzer, right? So an RQ of 1.0 indicates that 100% of the fuel is being provided by carbohydrates, right? So if you're at an RQ of 1.0, you are consuming strictly carbohydrates during exercise, right? This is exercise at its highest intensity, right? That's what you refer to, right? You are 100% working as hard as you can. It means you are consuming all of the oxygen you bring in, okay? But then we've got an RQ of 0.7. Indicates that fat is supplying 100% of the fuel, right? So that means that exercise, I don't like this now because it's not really exercise, whatever. Exercise is at its lowest intensity. You know what? Sorry. I'm going to change this RQ of 1.0. The body is working at its highest intensity, right? So that's exercise. An RQ of 0.7 is the body is working at its lowest intensity. There we go. That's a better description. So an RQ of 0.7, if you're doing 100% fat, just like Raul, like you nailed it earlier, right? You are sleeping. That's your lowest intensity. So you are consuming only 0.7 or 70% of the oxygen you bring in. So not very much. A lot of that is getting exhaled. So normal activities and daily exercise exist in a combination between 0.7 and 1.0 in regards to oxygen consumption, right? And so that's what we're going to see there, right? If we look at like an respiratory quotient, right? If we look at our RQ here, we're going to see sort of a backwards relationship between these two. Don't worry about calculating these numbers here, but there's what we're seeing, right? As your intensity climbs, your energy from carbohydrates goes up, and as your intensity declines, your energy from fat. So working at a higher percentage of your VO2 max means that you are consuming all your oxygen. That's what VO2 max stands for. It's the volume of oxygen consumed maximally. You're here, or maybe you're at medium intensity and you're somewhere here, and now you're using like a blend. So that's what we're seeing. We see an inverse relationship there. So summarizing everything up, bioenergetics is how we understand how we turn all this energy stuff into other stuff, mostly squats. Metabolism is any reaction that's taking place, and it's going to use your substrates in order to do that. ATP is the chemical that allows us to use to break energy and use that energy to do work. And RQ is how we determine which of those substrates we are primarily using for fuel. By the way, if you don't have any carbohydrates in your diet and you are working at a super high intensity, your body will find carbohydrates from somewhere else. It'll convert it through gluconeogenesis. Hopefully it's doing that from fat molecules, but it could also do it from your enzymes. It could do it from your muscle. And chances are it likes to do it from muscle because muscle burns a lot of calories. And if your body's like, man, we aren't getting enough calories to supply energy to this giant ass body, I guess we should have a smaller body. And so we'll break them down. So that's it. Questions, comments, concerns. What am I doing on Saturday night? Answer, quarantined, nothing.
Good answer, man.
Raul, do you have any questions about anything? This is your first time seeing this stuff.
Just the IQ is a little confusing to me, honestly.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Is it confusing because it's not on a scale of 100 to 0?
I'm just not understanding the numbers really.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because it's going from like a blend of like 1.0 to 0.7, right?
Yeah.
Everything below 0.7 is all the normal oxygen that it takes to keep your body running at its baseline. So like me standing right now, I'm probably at an RQ of like 0.71. You know, like I'm not really doing much more work than if I were sleeping. You know, I'm just standing upright. Well, yeah, let's just for the sake of argument, we'll say 0.72. Now, 0.71. Right? Like I'm just sitting around. So like you're still consuming oxygen. Like your body's cells are taking in that oxygen and they're using it to keep you alive. Because you got to remember like duration, right? How long have your cells been breathing? Since before you were born. You know, so they've been at it for a while. They are in their aerobic metabolism. And so like you're consuming you're always consuming massive amounts of oxygen. But as you start to exercise, you're going to consume more of that oxygen. You're also going to bring in more oxygen because you're going to start breathing harder and you're going to start carrying it more quickly and it's going to get processed faster. And that's how you're able to kind of keep up actually. But eventually there's a tipping point where you just can't consume any more oxygen. And so no, you can't get enough in to process everything that all the work that you're doing. And that's where you eventually just get so much lactic acid that builds up that you have to slow down. But when you're working as hard as you can, that's an RQ of 1.0. You are bringing in, let's say for the sake of argument, we'll use flat numbers. We'll say we'll go on a scale of like up to 100. Now remember, like I said, as you do more work, your intensity is going to climb, your consumption is going to climb. So instead of like right now, let's say I bring in 100 units of oxygen, I'm going to consume 72 of them, right? Because I'm standing upright.
Yeah.
But if I start exercising, I'm also going to start breathing harder. So maybe I'm going to consume 500 units of oxygen. But at some point, I'm going to get to like a super high intensity, and I'm going to consume 500. I'm sorry, I'm going to bring in 500, and I'm going to consume all 500. That means I'm eating 100% of them. I'm using 100% of it. And all of it's coming out as CO2. That's what that machine's measuring, actually. It's measuring how much oxygen's coming in versus how much CO2 is going out. So
is it different for like different people? Like say like if you did a high intensity workout and someone else did, would their levels be different?
Our milliliters of oxygen consumed, our numbers would be the same based on like our relative intensity. Like who knows, I could be doing 6 miles per hour and somebody else could be doing 4 miles per hour, but our relative intensity is the same. Like we could both be at an RQ of 0.85 because maybe I have longer legs. But I also weigh more. So that's where we're on this like sliding scale. So remember when we talked about METs a couple days ago? You consume 3.5 milliliters of oxygen for every kilogram of body weight that you have. So the more body weight that you have, the more number of molecules are coming in. That's why, like I said, like it is on a sliding scale. Like as you start to do more work, you start taking bigger breaths, right? Like you're bringing in more units of oxygen, but the percentage of how much is consumed is kind of, it's a percentage base, so it's the same. So even if I brought in 500, 70% of 500 would be 350, right? 70% of 100 would be 70. Those are still the same percentage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get you.
Cool. And actually, so let me do one final example. Let's take the number of molecules out of it, and let's just say for some reason, maybe you have a limited lung capacity or something, and when you're resting, in a normal breath, you bring in 100 units of oxygen. But even at exercise, let's say you still bring in 100 units of oxygen. We just went over how that's not how it works, but in order to keep the math simple, let's just say it's 100 to 100, right? So I'm laying down, sleeping. I'm bringing in 100 units of oxygen, and I'm exhaling 30 units of oxygen. I consumed 70 of them, but 30 of them got exhaled. Let's say I'm doing burpees as hard as I can. I bring in 100 units of oxygen. I will exhale 0 units of oxygen. The only thing I'm exhaling is pure CO2 because I'm using all of it. That make sense? Maggie?
So even though everyone's high intensity is different, like your high intensity is different than my high intensity. I'm going to be breathing a lot heavier at a certain point than you might be breathing, so even though the high intensity is different for each person, the numbers are going to be relatively not the same.
The numbers percentage-wise will be the same.
Percentage.
The numbers based on body size, body weight, and things like that. Like if you were to like count the molecule, like the trillions and trillions of molecules of like oxygen, like atoms, that number is going to be totally different for everybody.
Okay. Yeah,
based on your body size.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. For each individual person and their, their way of doing, how well they are at doing this, okay. Got it.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is still like percentage based. That's why we can use a scale like your VO2 max to determine like how, you know, healthy you are. But when we're calculating that number, we got to put in your age, your height, your weight, right? We got to put in all those numbers and use that crazy long Rockport formula, right? We got to use all those numbers to figure out like what's relative to you. And that way we don't take somebody who's 5'5"
Right.
and somebody
So
who's like 7'1"
right.
and
So
measure
it's
your
relative
VO2s
to,
differently.
right. So it's relative to that individual person, but everyone's base is the same. Like you go off the same scale.
Yep, it's all the same. Yeah, that's what the scale. That's percentage. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yep, percentage or scale, whichever. Yeah. Nailed it. It's pretty good.
Sweet.
All right, guys. I love these Q&As at the end. This is why I'm always so like, it always feels a little tense at the end of the call. So I'm like, any questions? And everybody's like, no. And I'm like, come on. Where things get really clear. Because like the slides don't have everything. Some of it just the stuff that falls between the cracks. That's where like most of the good learning. Those are where the kernels are. But yeah. By the way, so we're gonna meet next week. I mentioned this last night, but we're gonna meet on Friday next week. I got approval to do another in-person day, which is exciting. Yeah, thank goodness. I try to do it every about 2 weeks, but sometimes we get the slap on the wrist. So, and then sometimes it just doesn't work out because I invite somebody over to my house that tests positive for COVID, like an idiot. Yeah, I want to meet next Friday. I will give you guys more details to come about like what it'll be. It'll probably, what I'd like to do is kind of show you how to flow a session. It'll be very body weight based, just because we're not going to have access to like a lot of equipment. But what I want to do, which we haven't done in a while, and I want to make sure that you guys, because I know like Maggie, your group is like heading off soon. Like I want to make sure that we all get a chance to feel like what a flow looks like. So we're going to go through, we're going to go through a warm up, a movement prep, an SAQ, a resistance section, and a cool down. So it will feel like a workout. However, that being said, I don't want to interrupt anybody's like at home workouts that they might be doing, or if people are going to the gym. So very similar to how we do it in Sochi. I want everyone to participate in all of the activity, but there's no judgment if we see some guy out there doing like, one push-up every like 10 seconds, you don't have to make it your workout for the day, but you do have to participate. And that'll be kind of what we look at. And yeah, it'll be kind of fun. It'll show you how to flow a session basically.
Nice.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right.
Sounds good, Brad.
Cool. I'll see you guys. Have a great weekend.
You too, man.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.
See ya.